Okay, so the other speakers want to come up, and anybody have some questions? I had a question for Mr. Perry. I got the most. So that project that you did, I think it was Moreno Valley, the center strip, and you said there was no irrigation put in? But then you had in the formula, you were figuring water needs. So was water brought in by a truck occasionally to water those, or did I just misunderstand what was happening there?
Well, thanks for asking that. The intent to not put an irrigation system in was to save the embodied energy of the pipe, as well as to not have to use energy to bring down water year after year. Most of us know that we can put a median in a city, it can last for 50 years or whatever length of time, and we were trying to avoid importing 2.5 acre-feet of water to this project year after year, and thereby save the energy or carbon footprint costs associated with that water. And taking advantage of that for a moment, the studies I do and looking at soil types and volume of water that can be retained in soil, and looking at runoff and calculating the water that you could capture and impound and infiltrate, I think that 50–60% of our landscapes can be sustained on rainfall alone and not need irrigation, supplemental irrigation. And feel that plants grow in response to the moisture they have, and they're self-regulating to a certain extent. When we encourage overgrowth through providing water throughout a long, warm season and facilitate excessive growth, and then we take the water off, a la removing lawns or just simply cutting back, you've created a plant that's really dependent upon that additional supplemental water. And I think we're caught in that syndrome pretty heavily these days. Great.
I had a follow-up question about recycled water. You didn't go into too much detail. Could you just talk a little bit about that? It seemed like it was something that you were saying would require more energy. On the other hand, it's a recycled material. So could you talk about that, recycled water for irrigation?
Yes, I think reclaimed recycled water is a wonderful source for landscape irrigation, and there's an energy cost associated and a carbon footprint cost associated with collecting that water, processing it, and then redistributing it. And so there's that cost. It's less energy than bringing water from Northern California or desalinating water. We have sort of a 1–2 step process. First we bring it in, and then we use it once, and then we treat it and use it a second time. So we need to average the costs of importing as well as treating and cleaning for reuse. So reclaimed water does have a little bit higher cost than you might first think about, because there was the initial importing cost that is part of the picture. That's right. Right, and that's a great question, because once you start getting into this assessment process, you realize the materials and energies and resources we invest to create these alternative systems costs a lot. And for my studies, by just looking at very simply bringing water to Southern California without creating the aqueduct, doing the pumping or replacing pumps, and all of these other ongoing maintenance issues, I just want to look at how much it costs to get here. And I do that, and I then look at how much fossil fuel use we have for maintaining a landscape. Very quickly, we see that we've exceeded any type of environmental benefit that landscape could achieve. And I think the green industry has this attitude that what we do is doing something beneficial, and this carbon footprint assessment says very quickly we're not. And we just need to be informed about it so we can look at alternatives or consider how we want to address the situation. But I guess I hear very commonly that we're doing wonderful things, and I'm afraid I don't quite see the picture that way.
Sort of along those lines, it's not so much recycled water, but it's how trees use water. And I neglected to bring up one of my samples, and this is my own tree. And I bought it and planted it. So I'm almost embarrassed, but it's an avocado tree. And I have to tell you, I have 4 avocados at home. This one I grew for 7 years, and it just never looked very good. And I kept dumping water on it, and we all know supposedly avocados take a lot of water. But I have 2 avocados that I grew when they were 4 inches tall. And one of them within about 7 years was producing a lot of avocados. One within 4 years, I had over 100 pounds of avocados. So you can grow trees from very small stock, and if the roots develop and get used to your native soils, they don't use as much water as this turkey did when I planted it, and I thought it was okay. But what you can see again is all these roots going round and round and round. I had to wash all the soil off, and obviously when I planted this tree, I didn't wash enough soil off to see, because this is 7 years of growth. So this tree had much smaller roots, and I probably saw what I thought was a healthy root ball, and I'm an arborist, and I still planted the tree. And it took me 7 years to decide that it wasn't worth watering anymore, and I dug it up, I cleaned it off, and now I talk about it. But I really, really firmly believe that we need to plant smaller nursery stock. We need to start smaller with our trees. They're compromised going in the ground, and they forever need more water than if we planted small plants that get used to our soils and used to our rainfall and the roots will grow out, and they will grow deeper when they're younger. If you've ever tried to pull up a little volunteer tree, it may have a root 3 feet long. And that's the tree that says, I want to grow here. We need to plant trees from seed. We need to plant liners. And we're not doing it in an urban setting.
Hi, this is for Bob too. You're on. When you had a slide about the MAWA, and you talked about the new adjustment factor that's 0.45 from 0.7. Can you talk about that a little bit? Maybe explain the change?
So I think most of us know the state had adopted back in 1992 a water conservation ordinance regarding landscapes, and it has a formula for us to use to come up with how much water landscapes should be designed to grow within. And in this regard, in my interpretation, it's simply you take lawn and what it needs, and you take 70% of it, and that's your new budget for your particular climate zone. And with the ongoing drought and Governor's proclamation of conserving water, this ordinance has been revisited and has been recently revised, and taking effect January of next year, landscapes will need to be designed for a budget that's based on 45% of the turfgrass water needs. And incorporated within that is to say no new landscapes in commercial settings should exceed 25% turf grass by square footage. Residential would be adjusted to 50%. So it's also targeted to come down from 70% to 50% of what an all-turf landscape would require.
Bill or Robin, if you could talk a little bit about the drip rings or bubblers in proximity to trees and how we should be planning on having them relocatable, or anything you'd like to add as the tree morphology of the roots close to the trunk versus where the water really needs to be.
I think it's a loaded question because soils matter and species matter and the size of the root ball. I mean, if it's one of those 36-inch boxes that was augured out into a hole, plant and pray, big tree, no place to go, how much should you water it? Where are the roots? Or did you plant a little seedling that was only this big? And did you did you send it to preschool? So I'm a big advocate that we need to plant trees and give in preschool. And then, yes, then I can answer that question. You need to water really near the root zone when it's young if you plant a small tree. And I'm an advocate that we should be planting not small species, but small specimens. But if it's a big, mature tree, then you've got to ascertain where are the feeder roots. What kind of soil. If you can see them, you have a pretty good idea where the root zone is. And unfortunately, most of the public stands at the trunk with a hose. That's where they think they need to water the tree, if they're watering it at all. Most people, if they have a tree that's not feeling very well, will simply say to you, if someone calls me and says, what's wrong with my tree? Most of the time I say, well, how often do you water it? And they go, water it? So, it's a really tough question, and I don't think there's one size fits all. In these urban settings, let's say parkways, usually there is no irrigation. People are told to bring in buckets. Ultimately, I think it's a hose is just as good as anything. Teach your kids, every week the new kid gets to bucket the tree and, saturate it. And I like your idea is, get the trees acclimated as much as possible to our rainfall because we waste all this water. So as architects, I think there's an obligation to start looking at how we can make every single piece of impervious surface pervious. That will go a long way to solving the plant water issues.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of times too, trees are just they seem to be set up for failure. I mean, they're all specced out. They have the perfect staking. They have the aeration piping down. They have the bubblers, and then it gets through the initial inspection, but then it falls on maintenance. And a lot of times you just see where if you go later on, you see dead trees that are all staked perfectly. And you take a look and you kind of wonder why. Well, the bubblers aren't working anymore, or maybe they're not coming on, or eventually they're hoping that they can transition so that the rest of the spray heads that do the shrub beds around it will take care of it. It's that follow-up too that makes it hard to determine what works, because 24-inch box, 36-inch box, I love the concept of putting a berm around the very edge of the box, or the edge of the root zone that they plopped in there, and getting water in there during establishment, then having another area that's watered outside of that area so that the roots can finally make their way out, because there have been a lot of big box trees that have died because they think they can just spray water on the top. But if you don't get that berm around the top of that 24-inch box or something, that's going to dry out real quick. So, yeah, we don't have a great answer, do we? But it's yeah.
Is the big answer. The trees
Oh, yeah.
are going in the ground, drought stressed, and they never get over it.
Yeah.
So, until we can improve what we're planting, I think it's going to be hard to improve what we're irrigating.
And we've all seen that volunteer come up in our yard tree that outgrows the tree that we grew. Yeah, exactly. So you are right on that. Yeah. You want to yell it? Okay.
We planted several sizes of plants, and in this regard, 1 gallons to 5 gallons. And some of the stock that came out were really liner in size. We're favoring the smaller plant that had a better root system for the foliage, that ratio. And so we actually had a 3-foot auger. We intentionally worked the auger in a way to not create slick sides to the plant pits. These soils are actually in Moreno Valley. They're somewhat alkaline, they're sedimentary, and they're clayey, so that created an issue, that we really needed to be thoughtful about, of not creating a container within a planter that confined roots as they expand. And so there was intentional rupturing and damaging of the side areas so that there could be eventual root penetration. But the key there, again, was hydrating the soil and making sure that field capacity was in the soil around the plant pit, put the plant in, watered it one more time, and that way the water of that installation step didn't get wicked out into the surrounding soil and sort of reducing its volume that would be available for the plant to use.
I don't know about that particular situation. It sounds commendable and interesting, but also probably not applicable to most places, because one of the things that has really changed over time, and I worked in a nursery, is that we're not supposed to amend tree holes. So this goes against what everybody learns about growing tomatoes. Get the best soil you can and compost and do all this stuff. And actually, when you're planting a tree, you should put the native soil back in the hole. You can dig it up, and unless you're going to, plant a tree in the size of an area of this room, and you've basically rototilled everything, which isn't necessarily a good idea either. But it's pretty important not to encourage your tree to stay in the hole you dig. So the only way, and I kind of teach this because I used to teach tree planting classes, but we dug square holes, and a tree root will, even if it's scarred and it's hard, if it goes down in a round hole and the root hits that hard surface, it's going to go round and round even in your soils around here, because I don't know about yours, but mine take a jackhammer sometimes to get through. But if you dig a sort of square hole, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it hits an angle inside the hole, the tree root is much more liable to go into that corner than to actually make a right angle turn and go back around and curl. And that's assuming the roots are not already predetermined like this, which is hopeless. I mean, this is a tree. Avocados should not take that much water, but I'll bet you a ton of people trying to grow them have the same problem I had, unless you plant a very, very small tree that's so small that you just think it's never going to grow and never have fruit, but it will. So don't put stuff in the soil most of the time.
Well, I think that's a very good suggestion. Following up on these projects is very important. Happily, we've been able to, with soil moisture sensors, monitor the moisture of these plants, and we are photographing and recording the growth, and we know that we have a certain number of years in which things favor our technique and strategy of planting, and yet we're mindful that we have not really gone into that 5th, 6th, 10th year of performance to see what may be the long-term implications. As a bit of a counterpoint to Robin's comment, the potting mixes that plants are grown in are remarkably well designed and enriched and situated for phenomenal plant growth. The daily watering of plants is a necessity in nurseries, so hydration levels do not drop. All things that, again, when you get to the larger and larger plant, become a greater and greater issue when you put that into a new location. The soil amending we did, including gypsum and other elements to compensate for the chemistry, the soil chemistry of the Moreno Valley soils, were decisions we made to create a transition and not a replacement to, or an intent to create, again, an environment that's just a little bit larger than the container, and then once those nutrients are absorbed and those plant has enlarged, that you're back to where you were with a container plant in a landscape setting. All based on trying to think of ways to achieve a landscape with less dependence on ongoing resources or initial site development, but things that still haven't been completely proven or sorted out in the industry yet.
I just got to go back to your project because it's intriguing. Did you design it to have the stormwater from the road go into that center median to supplement the water during the winter season?
No, we were not able to. We came in at the end of the project. The median was going to be paved over because there was no budget for landscape, and the monies were found, and we're out there saying we can do things like this, and it's time to test some of these things. And we look at the watershed area, and just as a simple example, if you get 8 inches of rain here, and your landscape's 1,000 square feet, and you have your 1,000 square feet of rooftop or pavement adjacent to it, you can get 16 inches of rainfall per year by concentrating that water in your landscape. And now you're really getting to a place where many plants with that amount of winter rain can grow appropriately. When the soil moisture starts to decline, the growth of the plants begins to be reduced, and plants start to transition into that point where without moisture, they're in a pretty stable place. And plants with adaptations to these climate conditions can endure moisture stress for quite a period of time. They just need that good winter recharge. In the case of Moreno Valley, we anticipate what we have is a 2-to-1 ratio of watershed for our plants. And so we're taking 4 to 6 inches and leveraging it into 8 to 12 inches of moisture.
And is the development of a plant palette for that situation, I mean, that has to have been a ton of thought and research behind it, and
No, all very easy. It's a southwestern plant palette. So you have Palo Verde, you have sweet acacia, Acacia smallii. We have Dazzlerions in there, Hesperallos. We're testing rosemary. We have Cassia or Senna, Philodendea. It's just really a Mountain States nursery plant list, let's say. We have the compact form of a jojoba that Mountain States has introduced, and it's spectacular. None of those plants have died. So it's not limiting in terms of the planting palette. But what we did is we planted everything very carefully spaced, both for observation purposes and knowing we didn't want to have 4 trees grouped together. We wanted sort of dispersed spacing so they had their territory to harvest or obtain the rainfall or water they could grow with. And hey, plants grow in response to how much water they get. And you can have a healthy Acacia smallii after 5 years with half the amount of water the next Acacia smallii gets. And you get that proportional size difference, but they're both very healthy plants. So we expect a landscape that's going to grow more slowly, mature at perhaps less than world-class sizes that only irrigation can afford. Yes, that was a big part of it. Small container plants, good root systems. The Senna Philodendea we got were 3 inches tall. We thought we got gypped from the nursery. Really worried about just not quite enough plant mass and embodied energy in its tissue, and none of those plants have died. They've just exploded.
And the plant available water had to have been an issue. That the clay still has a fairly high holding capacity. So you said you got it up to field capacity before you put them in. So
right.
There must have been quite a bit of water available.
Proportionally and relative to the size of the plants, yes. We did plant under the requirement of the city 6 Swan Hill olive trees, 24-inch box. They're barely surviving. They're not growing. They're not increasing. We're just hopeful that those plants will, develop some roots eventually. And good example of again, what we've been talking about, of these larger plants have great need for regular water to enable roots to emerge. Right, right. No, no. Michelle.
So it's again for you, Bob, or maxing out. But, your style of planting with the water banking is something we did at Fish and Game Restoration. And I always would marvel people as I switched to the landscape architecture side of like, look, we had Boy Scouts out there on Saturday, you know, but we went through the process of digging holes and honoring. The difference is that in our profession, we're dealt with sites that have been graded and compacted and water trucks have driven over it, and all the life has been just completely obliterated from that soil structure. And so we found at our firm that we need to add some amendments, not nearly as much as we would for a horticultural plant for natives. So maybe could you touch on, you know, what you're seeing on that? I know you straddle the restoration and the, you know, native sites where you're just digging holes and everything's intact versus a new construction site and the amendments.
Well, I do find I choose to use some amendments in most situations, trying to find what I consider to be a balance between the growing environment of container plants and the site conditions that we often encounter, which are often soils that are without organic matter or any soil life and are compacted heavily. So we are trying to particularly improve the structure of the soil so that that oxygen that Bill's referred to several times is down there along with the moisture. And if there is a soil chemistry issue that can be remedied a bit, we work on that, meaning if it needs to be just a little bit more acidic, or we want to open up the tightness with gypsum, we take those steps. And we're really into mulching as the first step towards creating providing the organic matter that decomposes and eventually draws the soil life there and becomes the food chain for the biological organisms in the soil, and then breaks down the minerals in the soil and the organics and releases nutrients to the plants. So it becomes a natural system in that regard. But we facilitate that as best we can, as best we understand soil science and chemistry. And it gets pretty complicated.
Feed the soil, not the tree.
Well, that's really it. Yes, we want a living soil system ultimately, because that's going to enable roots to grow and the transfer of nutrients and moisture to the plants. We want it on a level that's just very moderate. We don't want fertilizers that stimulate a flush of growth and then sort of hits the wall and collapses, or water in the same way. You give plants lots of water, overextend their growth, and then cut it off. You need to set things in motion and have a system that keeps building and increasing and growing, and then the landscape follows suit. And it's just a natural model. Amy.
Well, then how do you keep the maintenance people from just blowing it all away? All the leaf litter on, I mean,
Education. Right.
jobs.
Good afternoon. So you were saying 24-inch box might be a large size, and there's probably not a one-size-fits-all solution. What size recommendations do you have for trees as you put them in landscapes? I mean, sometimes you can get a 3-inch, but you know we all need a little bit of instant gratification for other people's houses. Do you have any insight on that?
I don't need a mic.
Well, I appreciate that, and because I manage the shade tree program here, we did give away 15-gallon trees. My suspicion is that at least half of those, and that was thousands, and probably I think it was 32,000 trees we gave away. I think the success rate was like 90% from what I understand. So they were living, but that was maybe after 7 years, and trees usually take 5 to 10 years to die if they're not going to make it. Case in point, my avocado was looking okay, and then and it started to just get brown, and no matter how much I threw at it. So this was only a 5-gallon when I planted it. So, you know, is it acceptable? A 36 is acceptable if it is well grown. A 48 could be acceptable. But the problem is that the ability for the institutions we have to actually do what the ANSI standards require, which is to inspect the roots, to make sure that these roots are not coiled. Once you get big box trees, it is not done. I have seen, I mean, I cringe when I see city trees, or for that matter, commercial development trees, or even private trees, and I find that actually the poorer people have the most success, because the people who have a lot of money to burn, they buy the big nursery trees and the big boxes, and they pay thousands of dollars, and then they hire an $8 gardener to dig the hole and they push it in. And on the other hand, the person who can't afford much goes down and buys the 1-gallon plant, and that's gonna, in general, do better. So it's not that the size of the bundle, and I know that Jeremy knows a little bit about this because in most of the country, they ball in burlap trees. Okay, we here in Southern California are one of the only places that grows like 99% of our trees in containers. And so the container growing concept all by itself is prone to conflict. And that's the problem that I brought here today, was to show you that this ginkgo was already root bound in the 4-inch liner. Okay, you can see it. You can see, right, if you come up, you're welcome to inspect. You can see the 4-inch liner already compromised. Then it got put into a 5. And I have no doubt that it would have been put into a 15 and bigger, and eventually somebody would pay a lot of money and have a very, very sick tree. And this is not uncommon. So, you know, I understand that you want to have something significant, especially as architects. You know, you can put in a decent sized shrub and perennials and throw in some annuals for color. And you know, when you want to plant a tree, I had a fit when they planted the oak tree at the public library downtown, and they had this majestic oak, it was going to go right in the middle, and they have to bring in an enormous tree. And I thought, if you want it there for 100 years, plant a little one. You know, I mean, it'll be growing and it'll be healthy. So, you know, I hate to say it, but it's not the size of the box, it's the health. It's get in there and look around. And I'm an arborist, I failed. Okay, I planted a bad tree even though I thought I looked at the roots. So my answer is, I don't plant a tree anymore, ever, without taking all the soil off the roots. You heard it here. Because I have run into so many experiences where the roots are so terrible that I want my trees to be water efficient. And I have about 100 fruit trees that I planted, most of them, and my water bill is considerably less than most of my neighbors because I monitor those roots. I plant them in native soil. I do not amend. I try to mulch. And I'm not perfect. I water my hands, by the way. So, you know, it can be done, but don't do that. Don't plant root-bound trees because they're not going to give you the sustainability that you want in the long term.
The problem is I can't put a very small tree in a municipal park and expect it to survive.
Well, I've heard that argument, and it's kind of like the food forest. You know, well, what if people might eat the fruit? You know, I've heard all about the vandalism. But my thought on that is two things. One is, what is the cost of that 36-inch box? Right. Not only to buy the tree, but the labor to plant it. Okay, so you have to have several people to lift the thing. And who's actually taking and separating those roots? Nobody in most cases. Okay, so you're not following ANSI standards, first of all. And then, so you can buy a lot of trees. You can afford to have some problems with the small trees. Okay, you can afford to have maybe 50% loss and still come out way ahead. And I do not actually believe that we would have that much loss. I mean, yes, there'll be some loss, but there's loss with the big trees too. And of course, my idea is that we need to start changing technology. There are grates, not grates, but like iron barrier type things that you see like in Balboa Park around trees that could be reused. You put them around a small sapling, you plant it. After that tree gets established, you undo it, you bring it over, you put it into the next one, and you have those things lined up in municipalities, and that becomes part of the tree. And guess what? You save on staking. No more staking. No more ties, saving money, less carbon footprint, healthier stock. And also that also helps with the pruning, because the smaller the stock, the less likely they are to be topped, the less likely they are to have structural problems, and what little pruning they need can be much easier done. I try to tell people all pruning on trees should mostly be done with a hand pruning. Okay, so that's your answer.
So I think at this point, we're going to thank our presenters once again for all their knowledge and all their time. I also have a few other people that I want to thank that without them, this would not have happened. And I think this has been an incredibly valuable experience for all of us. The other members of the Stewardship Committee put in tremendous amount of time and energy into these events. Michelle Landis, raise your hand, please. Sharon Lowe, right here in the front. Catherine was not able to be here today, but without her, we would not have been as successful. Also, Kevin Mock. Kevin. And the idea man behind this, John Rosinski, right over there. So again, we do have quite a few sponsors that you can speak to out during the networking and reception hour. So please go and thank them for participating and being the sponsors, and learn more about their products. I also want to say that this event is actually part of an overall month-long festival called Arctober Festival. And if you Google it, you'll find a whole calendar of events that are being put on by various organizations in the design community in San Diego. And there's almost an event every day if you're interested, so definitely look into that. You can find links on the San Diego ASLA website to the Arctober Festival page as well. And with that, I think it's time to open up the bar, and everyone.
That we're gonna, the stewardship posts information and links.
That was my first bullet that I didn't say. Okay, so just so you know, all of you that were scribbling down all the information that our presenters were writing, all the slides for the presentation will be available on the Stewardship Committee website, as well as the video. Sebastian, right over there in the corner, has been videotaping this whole thing. So that might take a little bit to get up, but that will eventually be on the website as well. All right.